inviting me. So Britt already gave my background, more or less. So I have a varied background with some philosophy components. Started out in neuroscience, working on neurotransmitters, DLP1's function in the brain. And then I moved on to cognitive linguistics and also did work in philosophy. After my postdoc in Australia with David Chalmers, I sort of went back to neuroscience on sort of a case study-based level. And that's sort of the work I'm going to present today. It focuses on our two main topics that we research in the Brogaard Lab for Multisensory Research, which is a condition called synesthesia and the other condition called savant syndrome. Our work is mostly on acquired forms of those, as we'll see, but I'll start with some introduction to the two conditions so that you have a little bit of a background to where we are coming from. So as was also mentioned, we are doing a lot of outreach with our research, and this is sort of our latest attempt to summarize some of our results in a language that's accessible to the general reader, so the reader without any particular educational background. So that was a book that came out with Penguin late last year in 2015. And of course, that was a lot of editorial work. So whenever you said, like, these studies indicate that P, they would sort of edit out these studies indicate that. So it was just P. So that's sort of what you could expect when you write for a popular audience with an editor. They will sort of edit out what makes you credible. So it was so that was a bit of a challenge. I might work on some academic books before I take that on again. But I do blog for Psychology Today, where there's less of an editorial sort of role in terms of editing the content, although occasionally they do a little bit of editing, especially if they want to feature an article. So sort of the talk outline, I'm going to give you this background on synesthesia and savant syndrome because it's not a topic that has been researched extensively. I'm going to mention just a pointer towards that 10,000 hour hypothesis. I can't give all of the evidence against that. So that was one of the goals of the Superhuman minds. But I'm going to sort of just point to why that hypothesis might be questionable. And then the hypothesis, which is sort of more in the academic spirit, is that we are sort of trying to establish a correlation among synesthesia, savant syndrome, and autism. We haven't done that much work on autism yet. And we are actually going into sort of neurotransmitter systems, which goes back to my degree in neuroscience, where I worked on neurotransmitters, actually hormones doubling as neurotransmitters in the brain. So my lab actually started with synesthesia, which is an unusual condition where you have binding among modalities or streams within one sensory modality. So you might have, for instance, numbers or letters printed in black, but for a particular synesthetes, they might have specific colors associated with each letter or each number, such that the visual field is actually producing, or there's colors in their visual field as a result of simply seeing these black letters or the forms, the shapes of the letters or the numbers. It was a condition that was actually described very many years ago. So in 1800, there were some case reports of people with synesthesia. It was called something else back then. But then around 1900, which was, or just before 1900, which was when psychology was still part of philosophy, and they had this big break in or disputes in the field of philosophy where some people wanted to do logic and the other people wanted to do empirical research. There was this split, and you can actually see that from the APA, which now means either the American Psychological Association or the American Philosophical Association, and a split around that time. And the empirically minded philosophers became the psychologists, and the logic people became the philosophers. And things, of course, have changed since then, but synesthesia was not a topic that either one of them wanted to look at, because the empirically minded philosophers became interested in just looking mostly at behavior and dispositions for behavior. So the behaviorist tradition made it as something that should not be looked at, because what you had at the time was verbal reports which were not considered reliable. That was part of the dispute, right? So introspection and so on was considered unreliable. So this is a condition that you could not study. And the people on the other side of philosophy, the people interested in logic, this had nothing to do with logic, so they were not interested in it either. And so it was not until 1980, around that time, that people began becoming interested in this phenomenon again, synesthesia, and that had to do with the development of more objective tools for investigating synesthesia. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So, so synesthesia, I mean, so yeah, it was, there are actually mentions of it from ancient Greek where it just means, there's like anesthesia means sort of without sense. Synesthesia means sort of that the senses come together. Now, what some of the indicators that this may be an objective phenomenon and not some kind of imagination on the part of the subject was the discovery that this was a condition that was running in families. So you have a greater chance of having a form of synesthesia if you had, say, a grandfather with synesthesia or some ancestor with synesthesia. We're talking at this point about synesthesia that develops from birth. And it's rare, but not as rare as you might think. So about 7% of the normal population have some form of synesthesia, but there are so many different forms that it's not like you can get like subjects easily for group studies. You can get subjects for group studies, but it's not as easy as you would think because there's so many different types, and you can't make group studies on different types of synesthesia. But about 7%, and that might reflect underreporting, partially because there's a tendency for females to be more eager to be research participants, which also led to a certain bias in the literature, thinking that females were more likely to have synesthesia. That has been debunked. There was also other kinds of biases that had to do with the fact that people did not always know that it was a condition. So there are many people who have the condition, but they think it's what everyone has, because it's not, depending on the kind, it's not necessarily something that comes up. And you're not going to ask other people, oh, do you see the number 3 as green? So that's probably a small figure compared to the real figure in synesthesia. So just a way of naming examples of synesthesia. So when you have sound as the input, and you have, say, color as the output, it would be sound-color synesthesia or sound-to-color synesthesia. There are lots of examples of other kinds. So sound color, grapheme color, those are the most common ones. But you also have more odd forms, like that words give rise to taste. So we had one subject where the word kiss would give rise to the taste, very specific taste of bread dipped in sort of a Tuscan tomato soup. And you can have people, we are looking at what it is about people that can give rise to smells, and it's not smells that people have objectively, but we think it might have to do with their facial expressions, so we're looking into that. but there are cases of people who, so synesthetes who can't be around certain people because it gives rise to this smell, which is not necessarily a positive smell. And also a common one is sort of the time period. So there are people who have sort of a calendar in their visual field laid out. So it could be the month from January to December, so they don't need to rely on the Google calendar or anything like that. They just sort of plug it into their calendar that they have laid out in front of them in visual space. Now, I should say that it's not always a phenomenon that occurs in the visual fields. So there are two, more than two, but two. One distinction is between projective synesthesia. Projective synesthesia would be where you actually have the produced sensation in your visual field. Hence projection. And there's another form that's called associated synesthesia, which is more conceptual, because it might be that you're thinking of the number 3, and that could then lead to another thought of green. But unlike, as we will see, unlike a regular association, so if you associate blue with sadness, this particular association has a certain nature that makes it different from regular associations, say cultural associations. So here's some of the marks of synesthesia. So it's involuntary or automatic. So it may be that you can think of the word blue without thinking of sadness. It doesn't seem to be automatic or involuntary to the same extent. So there's a much tighter connection, even if it is not always perceptual, but sometimes it can be conceptual. Also is systematic. So if you have, if 2 gives rise to reds today, it's not the case that the number 2 gives rise to green tomorrow and brown on Sunday. So there's now a test for that kind of synesthesia. It's called the synesthesia battery, which is online. And what the subjects are exposed to, basically 2 tasks. So they get basically a color space where they have to adjust hue, brightness, and saturation for each of the letters or numbers. So that's for the grapheme color synesthesia. And that's in a color space where they basically have, so first they pick the hue, right? And then they get various brightness and saturation. And then they have to pick a space in that sort of display of the colors. And then once they have done that, there's a speed test or a response time test where you represent that with letters and or numbers in a random fashion. Each letter or number will show up 3 times, but again in a random fashion. And then you will have, there's a little square with a very specific hue, brightness, and saturation. So it might be a shade of blue. And you quickly have to say yes or no to that. And the response time is then calculated. And so you then get 2 measures. One is sort of, so for the first test, the letters where you have to pick the colors is repeated 3 times. And the other one is also repeated 3 times. So you get 2 numbers. The first is based on distance in color space between the 3 sort of presentations of numbers and letters. And the second one is also looking at accuracy and also response time. And then they have some cutoff that's probably set a little bit too low according to recent discussion. But if you fall under that, then you have synesthesia for that particular kind of synesthesia. So there's stability over time. We have worked with child subjects where we have measured them once a year to see how stable it actually is over time. And there was very little variation. So one child subject, the earliest was around age 3, and the latest we have is age 10, testing each year. And there was some fading, so for dark brown to light brown, but there was no change, say, in hue. So it was very, very consistent for that many years. The only exception was the number 0, which suggests that there might actually be higher areas of the brain involved in sort of developing this synesthesia, though it may not be the case for all subjects. But for this particular subject that I was just talking about, the number 0 did not have a consistent color until a certain age. As I said, we also have brain imaging that can show that whether people have synesthesia. It doesn't always show it, but what you can see, for instance, is activity for color synesthesia, which is what we mainly study. You can see that there's activity in the visual cortex in response to something that is not colored. So you have the contrast condition, and then you have hyperactivity in visual cortex. So this is just the regular Stroop effects that you would learn in any cognitive psychology class. So the idea here is that you are supposed to mention the ink color. So you're supposed to not read the words. And so you would go, if this was the display, you go something like, if you go from left to right, you would go red, blue, red. And of course, you have the contrast condition where you would just have blue printed in blue, green printed in green, and so on. And people do that, of course, very fast. But in the standard Stroop effect case, you slow down. So I even had to slow down to even give you the example. So it's tempted to say yellow for yellow, even though the ink color is red. So what is going on there is just that we are so used to read the words that they interfere with our ability to just perform the other task, which is just to name the ink color. So that's the very old Stroop effect. What's interesting is that it also shows up in synesthesia, but in a slightly different way. So one way that it has been conducted for the grapheme color synesthesia is that you have some contrary color that's contrary to the synesthesia. So let's say that the number B is red for them. If you print it in red, they do it fast, right? They can name the ink color fast. If you print it in green, they are slowed down. Okay, so there's various discussion of how much of this is actually a Stroop effect and how much is the synesthesia, but it seems that the synesthesia can also, because of the projection out, can also interfere with their ability to name the colors, which suggests that it may be sort of an attentional perceptual effect. So this is a very simple form that was originally proposed by Ramachandran of the pop-out effects. This applies only to certain projector synesthetes. We have done more complicated visual search tests, but this is an example, the original one, where if you ask normal people, so the control population, to find the 2s among the 5s, it will take them not long, but it will take them some time to identify the shape. So in this case, you would have to identify the shape, right? So the shape of the 2s, so you have this triangle of 2s right there. But let's say that you have a synesthete who has the color green associated with 5 and the color red associated with the number 2. It should look something like that, right? So not quite, because we can talk about that in the Q&A or later today. But it's not as if the letters are not also seen by them as printed in the original color. But something like that should actually be what they're seeing. And so they don't need to search, because you just have a regular pop-out, just like you have now. Now you don't need to search. You just have the pop-out of the triangle of 2s, and you can immediately say, yes, that's a triangle, as opposed to a square of 2s. So you also get that, the pop-out effect, which it is, some people take that to also be an indication that it's a perceptual phenomenon as opposed to a higher order phenomenon. in the sense that pop out sometimes is interpreted as something that is pre-attention, sort of pre-perceptual processing. So sort of a kind of capture attention as opposed to top-down attention. What is more interesting is that recent studies have shown, so in this particular case, it's grapheme color, synesthesia. So when you have the form area, which is sitting right next to the color area, you can actually see connections between the areas that you don't see in normal individuals. And there are various theories about how that could happen. And the most popular theory is that we all actually are born with synesthesia, so these extra connections, because we know that we all have extra connections from birth, and that the pruning process that takes place through childhood and during the teen years and sort of partially ends in early adulthood, that kind of pruning process is not working perfectly in synesthesia. So Julius Simner has a recent article out showing that there's a genetic basis for synesthesia that actually coincides with some of the processes involved in that kind of brain pruning. So that would make sense that they don't have this perfect pruning and something is left over. And so you have these cross wirings. That has also been found for sound color synesthesia, where you have these extra connections. So that's a little bit more of objective evidence. Something I'm not going to go much into in this talk in order to make it through everything I want to say is just sort of, you would think that if you have synesthesia, unless it's a byproduct of something else, and that is a hypothesis out there, is a hypothesis that Julius Simner has also advanced, which is that it actually lines up with people who have immune systems defects, and that it may simply be a byproduct of that. But if you take synesthesia sort of at face value, you might think, well, what kind of evolutionarily benefit would it have? Why would it have survived in populations over the years? And some of the things that has been shown to be the case in various empirical studies is that synesthetes very often have an improved memory, typically in the area of their synesthesia, though it can go beyond that. Improved visual search skills. We have seen a case of that that's sort of natural. There are also unexplainable cases that we'll get back to. We have also seen, in some cases, improved math skills. We have seen, this is very common, an increase in creativity. So if you look at, instead of doing a regular population study where you give it the 7% figure for synesthesia, if you just make a population study on artists and also musicians, you will see the figure go up remarkably. So there's a greater percentage of people with creative skills who also happen to have synesthesia. Of course, that doesn't show a causal relation, but it does show a correlation. The warning mechanism I'm going to skip because that is very specific to certain kinds of synesthesia, which is something we can get back to. This is a kind of visual search. Unfortunately, this doesn't work on my Google Slides, but basically this is a DIF file where it flicks between, so you have these two images, right, and it flicks between the two images. And basically, so one of these parts, it could be that one, or it could be that one, or it could be that one, pops in and out of existence. But what normal individuals do is that they do actually, we've done some eye tracking, where they actually search pretty systematically until they find the one which, in this particular file, if it had worked, is actually this one, which you can't see here. But it takes subjects quite a while, and also you can see how they do systematic visual search, where somewhat mysteriously there are synesthetes who do not have any specific sensitivity to nature or anything like that, but they immediately notice the change, like consistently. So we have many of the different kinds of these much more complicated visual search tests, and they sort of consistently notice the change a lot faster, which is not something that we are yet able to explain, but just an observation that we have noticed. Very quickly, there are occasional disadvantages of synesthesia. It's more the extreme cases, and so there can be hypersensitivity to colors, sounds, and so on. We have one subject who has sounds associated with flavor of food and actually has bad experiences in restaurants with loud music, so the food actually tastes different for him because the sounds sort of are part of how the food tastes to him. So if the sounds are loud, they somehow interfere and the food tastes differently. What's more common is actually people with an extreme form of sound color synesthesia. So whenever they hear sounds, their visual field fills with sort of color. And in some cases, so there's one subject in Australia, his case was so extreme that if he passed a construction site or if he was in a loud room, say a bar or something like that, the colors were so extreme that he literally could not see. So he actually had to get a certificate or something like that for legal blindness in those situations because he literally couldn't see, whereas he would be perfectly fine in a room right now. It's not a lot of noise. Okay, so that's synesthesia. I'm going to go back to that when I get to my case studies. With Savant syndrome, I'm going to just go over the introductory remarks fairly quickly so I can get to some of our results. So that can also occur from birth, and in autism is about 10%, and that probably is also a smaller figure than the real figure, but it's been sort of shown that it's at least 10% of individuals with autism have Savant syndrome. Savant syndrome is not just having remarkable academic skills or a high IQ. So Savant syndrome is very difficult to define now because it used to be defined in a derogatory way as the idiot savants. And the idiot savants were very typically people with severe forms of autism, but with this very narrow skill that they had. And so in that sense, it was sort of easy to define that they had this remarkable skill compared to their underperforming condition or sort of low functionality. But then it was discovered that people have it from birth even without autism, and then we went into cases where it was acquired. And so it's difficult to define. So we try to go as close to the original definition as possible, where we sort of look at what's the overall functionality of the individual. And this particular skill, is it remarkable compared to their overall functionality? So you may not have a person with Savant syndrome who is an Einstein, all right, who can, or even like a limited Einstein in a certain area. It may be that what they can do is something you can do too. But if you have full functionality in addition to that, you would not call you a savant. So savants need not have skills that you don't have. They could have skills that are just remarkable compared to their overall condition. I just want to go quickly over the classical cases, as some of them are very familiar to people. There's not a lot of evidence for this, except, well, there's evidence, but there's not a lot of research on this. But Blind Tom was this autistic slave in Georgia. It actually helped him out because his owner found out that he has these remarkable musical skills, and then he got to play the piano instead of slaving away. So that might have been a good thing. This one was featured in the media, in the US at least. And this is also a person with autism. He has a very sort of fundamental language and low functionality, but he has this almost photographic memory or photographic vision. So in the documentary, he's taken on a ride around London. It takes 12 minutes. It's a helicopter ride, and that's it. They just circle around. And then they go back and they have sort of a circle of canvas. And though you can't quite see it here, he can draw this, what he saw on this 12-minute helicopter ride with extreme precision, and that goes down to like the windows and so on. And that's all of the exposure he had to the scenery, but he can sort of commit that to memory and draw it. The human computers also features the media K and Fro are two autistic twins, and they have very low functionality, but they mostly spent their days sitting on the couch. But if you ask them about a date, so any date like January 15th, 2004, so they're watching these TV shows, game shows, they can tell you exactly what the host was wearing on that particular day. You can just pick an arbitrary day, and they can tell you like the clothing of the host or what they ate. The clothing of the host, of course, is more interesting because you can go back and check, whereas what they ate could be more subjective, but you can go back and check. This is reported by Oliver Sacks. So autistic twins, again, who would sit in the corner of the library, low functionality, could do almost nothing, but they apparently had this ability to come up with very high-digit prime numbers, so they would sit and compete about who could come up with the greatest prime number. And then, of course, there's the very famous Kim Peek, who was the inspiration for the movie The Rain Man. And as we'll see, he actually didn't have autism, even though the movie character does. But he was on the set. He could inspire the movements and the gestures and the facial expressions for the movie. So it should be obvious, but this is Kim Peek, right? And he was a living encyclopedia in the sense that he would read in the library most of his day, but he would also remember most of what he read, and he would not just read sort of history books and nonfiction books. He would also read maps, and he apparently was also a great DPS because he could sort of give you directions between almost any two cities in the world. So if your GPS system didn't work, you could sort of hire him for the day. Well, he wasn't actually hireable, but in principle. To say, but just a bit more about him. He had other abilities also, calendar calculation. I should say, I'll go back to that in a bit. I should say that he didn't have autism. I mentioned that what he was lacking with the three main connections between the two hemispheres of the brain. So there's some information transfer that's subcortical, but the three main connections are actually lagging from birth. So he did not have split brain syndrome, which tends to be the case when you perform surgery on people later. He did not have that syndrome. So he did not have autism. He was simply born without the three connections. And somehow, though we're a bit skeptical about that, but he's reported as having been able to read 2 pages of a book at the same time, right? So, but it could be that he was skipping from one page to the other and somehow getting the overview. This one is also a famous case. He wrote his own book, Born on a Blue Day. Daniel Tammet. He is a speed calculator. He can calculate things faster than a calculator. He also holds the European record in reciting pi, in his case, to 23,000 or so decimal points, which is not even the record. The record is up in around 60,000 decimal points of pi. Okay, so a lot of these have, what they have in common is autism, except for Peek. I mentioned that. He was missing the three connections between the brain's two sides. Now, I'm going to move on now to some of our results, and they are a little bit different because the cases we looked at were cases where people have the conditions from birth, so they're developmental or directly from birth. In our cases, we're looking at people with brain injury or disease, and they are very rare. So we primarily do case studies. The group studies we do are more on regular cases of synesthesia and so on. We still do some of that. But the case studies, we simply cannot do group studies because we do not find people who are similar enough to put them in a group and get anything meaningful out of it unless we sort of infer from the individual case studies. So they're sort of all case studies. This is one of our most recent ones, so we have less evidence information of that. She was featured on Nightline recently. She was a farmer in Colorado and was the manager of a farm there, sort of on a mountaintop. And one day when she was feeding chickens, she slipped. There was sort of some muds, and she slipped, and she fell down the mountain. Luckily, a tree caught her, so otherwise she probably would have been dead. But she got caught in the tree. She had to be cut out. She was flown to a trauma hospital by helicopter. And what she had a partial spinal fraction in a couple of places. When it's partial, that's sort of good news because you can regain mobility. If it's just sort of complete, you can't, or probably can't. There's some new results, but you probably can't regain mobility. So she was paralyzed, but temporarily. And she had brain damage. Her teeth were hurt, so she had to have tooth implants and facial reconstruction. And they did not focus much on her brain because it didn't seem to the doctors that there was much going on with her brain. So she seemed to have certainly traumatic brain injury, but they were mostly focused on her partial spinal fractures and trying to get her regain her mobility. And later, she contacted our lab and said, well, you know, I think that I just lost interest in these farm animals, and all I'm doing is sort of drawing. So you can just see some in the background. She has a lot more. So she's doing this drawing and poetry now, and she so her interest shifted, and she also, I mean, these paintings, these might not be her best ones. But we had them evaluated by some art experts who actually gave them quite positive evaluations. And she had none of that before. She was only interested in sports in college, got a degree in some kind of physical education, and she then became a farmer. So she had no prior skills. So that is a case where you could call her a savant, not that no one else can do equivalent artwork, but compared to her overall conditions, she has very low functionality. She also lost some memory in the process of her fall, which we're also looking at what the reason is. She also has, this is unusual, but she actually has more flat emotions. So this is something that may have to do with her particular conditions. So that's definitely some damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is a part of the brain that's involved in interpreting emotions. So it may be that she has perfect amygdala activity, but she has some problems interpreting her emotions, and she very often actually has difficulties grasping emotional concepts. So to what extent she feels the emotions but can't grasp what they mean, or whether she just has flat emotions, that's something that we're still looking into. So also a new case, Sally Bernard, former realtor. There are two things that could have caused. So she was a realtor, no interest in painting. Again, her interest shifted. She started painting. This is just one example. She has tons. She has a website. The reason we don't name them by initials is that these are public figures. And once they're public figures, we don't have to name them by initials, by the way. So we're not violating privacy. But that's her. Very new case, so we don't have that much. But The one event that she cites and where we have hospital records is that she had this kind of stress condition for her heart, that's a weakening of the heart muscle, which does produce an excess of adrenaline that's about 2 to 3 times as much as in a heart attack, and even more compared to a normal person. And since adrenaline, of course, also has a role to play in the brain, it's possible that that may have triggered what she has. But what we also found was that she had some early signs of the one on the left. Less talked about frontotemporal dementia. So this is Alzheimer's. She doesn't have that. Alzheimer's is where you very quickly start to forget things that are recent. You might be able to remember things that are in the far past. In frontotemporal dementia, it's on, well, as the word indicates, it's like partially, very often left-sided. So initially, the symptoms might just involve sort of problems in decision-making, but also as time progresses, it might involve the loss of language, so it's very often left-sided. So here's another example. I mean, these are progressed cases. In her case, it's definitely not progressed. So we have 2 conditions here. It's likely that they are completely unrelated, but her condition, her painting, started around the same time as when she was in the hospital with her heart condition and the excess adrenaline. We don't know if there's a connection or whether this prefrontal frontotemporal dementia, whether that is the main cause. This is something that's well documented. When people have frontotemporal dementia, it's very, very common that they start becoming autistic. So they have damages to, among other places, the left side of the frontal lobe. And somehow that frontal lobe, which also suppresses activity, artistic activity, mainly on the right side, apparently that lack of suppression of activity can get those autistic areas to develop. There are cases preceding this, many cases preceding this, where they have been described in some detail, but unfortunately not in terms of the neuroscience. So we're not completely sure what's going on in these cases. Also a new case, so again, we don't have so much evidence. It's a very new case. She's not a public figure, except in terms, so this is actually not her. This is her, but you can't see her. This is not her. So she is not, so GMS had a skateboarding accident, major traumatic brain injury, and she had a sudden obsession with art and poetry. And what the scan seems to also seems to involve some condition, which of course, again, we can't always confirm whether this is a result of the injury or not, because we don't get the people at the time of the accident. So the first thing that when people go to a hospital with a brain injury is not like, where can I find a lab that investigates this, right? So we usually get them much later. So we can always confirm that the condition that we can look at and see that they have, whether that was caused by the accident. Okay, so into the older cases that we have studied, where we have more data. So this is Derek Amato. He was a salesperson, interested in sports. He was playing ball with his buddies and mistook the deep end of the pool for the shallow end and dove after the ball into the pool. Luckily, he didn't actually break his neck, but he did have traumatic brain injury, and which led to a kind of synesthesia that I haven't yet talked about, which is called mirror touch synesthesia, that has also been featured in the media recently, where they misdescribe it as feeling what other people are feeling, which is not quite right. what they have is a deepened sense of empathy, and according to our most recent studies, also an increased ability to read faces. So if you have an increased ability to read faces, facial expressions, and you also have a deepened sense of empathy, then it may be sort of loosely described as feeling what other people are feeling. So that's the synesthesia that's called mirror touch. And then he has a Savant syndrome after 3 days of sort of recovery from this, which was presumably a concussion. His interest shifted. He gave up as a salesperson and just wanted to play the piano. We don't know what that sounded like at the time. We don't have any records of that, but he did go to a friend's house and started playing the piano. He had no piano interest or practice or background before this. But what we do know is that it didn't take that many years, a few years, before he was touring America and was giving concerts and also was recording several albums. So much faster than you would think that people in normal circumstances who just suddenly develop an interest in the piano. So we don't know if what he played the first time he played the piano sounded horrible, but certainly there was evidence that he very quickly picked up some of these skills. His brain is very strange, so we don't really know what to do with it. So here's some white spots that you get on the regular structural MRI. But we actually found various white spots elsewhere too, so we don't quite know what to do with his brain. And then when we asked him, it turns out that he has had multiple concussions in the past. So we're not quite sure what to do with that. We have not yet found either a way to do functional MRI on him. There are some limitations to functional MRI. You can use sound, you can use imaging, I mean, at least on the one we have, but you can't have people like playing an instrument inside the functional MRI and so on. But what we did do, so this is just sort of there was some personality changes as well. What we did do was we simply borrowed an old measure. Again, the Stroop test, as we saw, has been used to measure obsession. It's been used to measure obsession in people with eating disorders, also in alcoholics, and also in people with drug addiction. Some controversy about what it shows and what it doesn't show, but we thought it might be fun to develop a measure here. And this is not actually the real test that we did. This is an example that I could write out on the slides. So we normally use E prime for this. But what you do here, if it was for eating disorder, what you would have here might be pizza, hamburger, and so on, right? So you would have food words if it was for eating disorders. In this case, we had different music words. Actually, we had a bunch of these, so these are just examples. And then you have people do what you do in a normal Stroop test. You just have them don't read the word, just mention the color, the ink color. So say red, green, blue, purple. I don't even know. Another purple, red, green. So that's the idea, right? And then you have, ideally, again, this is just sort of a quick example. So these are maps for length, right? Also, the color and position on the page have to be the same. Also, the frequency, so this is the hard part. You have to find words where the frequency will match up. This is the control. So for the eating disorder, right, so instead of pizza, you could have plain, right? You could do it with eating disorders. It's a standard test, somewhat controversial test, but it's possibly worked. And it did work in our case. So he was much faster when the words were not music-related than he was when the words were music-related. Again, and that's because if these draw attention, right, because you're obsessed with something, then that will slow down your real task, which is not to actually think about the words or read the words or process the words, but just to name the ink color. So it's similar to the regular Stroop test, and so it's at least worked in this case. It's a possible alternative measure of attentional bias, or in these cases, obsession, actually. Okay. Okay. So Jason Paget was our first case study. He was somebody tried to steal his wallet, hit him on the head, and what happened was that he developed a condition where he doesn't see motion in a continuous fashion. So this is an extreme case. His is not as extreme, but this is the original case that is described in literature. You pour water in a glass. The next picture you see is that. The next picture you see is that. And the next picture you see is like flowing over. So you see motion, but you don't see it as continuous. And his is more like pressing a pause button on an old VCR. So we found some damage to to the motion area. But he started drawing. He started seeing the world in geometrical figures, and he started drawing what he was seeing, so by hands. So these are just some cases where he was drawing things. And what we did was, in his case, so in the meantime, we had him use some of that way of, he was sort of understanding certain mathematical patterns in terms of these images. So we had some basic mathematical formulas where he actually started seeing those mathematical formulas, so they would be the inducers, and they would give rise to the same sort of images. So this is just the baseline where you can see like lots of baseline, meaning nonsense formulas, lots of activity in the visual cortex, and it's two-sided. And here are the formulas that give rise to his synesthesia, and you can see that it's very one-sided, which is very common. So you see that in a lot of people, that is very one-sided. And also, that was a bit surprising that we didn't find any activity in the visual cortex. But then we look back at a study of Daniel Tammet that I mentioned earlier, of his synesthesia. And the people who did that also found a similar kind of pattern. So that was interesting that in those two cases of people with special skills and synesthesia, it seemed to be sort of a higher form of synesthesia. We also just did some transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a better way of getting causal connections. So we just inhibited the areas we found on the functional MRI in order to see whether that would inhibit the synesthesia, which it did. So what's going on? Since I don't have much time left, I'm going to leave a lot of this for the Q&A. But in the case of brain injury, what we know is very little about what actually happens in these cases. We do know a lot about brain injury, and we do know that there's a kind of cell death that leads to a flooding of neurotransmitters of certain areas of the brain. And we also know that that's elevated. The neurotransmitters are elevated, mostly glutamate and serotonin, which can function as an excitatory neurotransmitter. And that seems to be, during that 1 month, that at least some structural connections are made. I'm going to skip that. As I said, we don't actually get people with traumatic brain injury and Savant syndrome when they get the injury. We also rarely have records of people prior to their accidents. Occasionally we do, but usually we don't. So it's really, really difficult to get further down and find out what goes on at the neurological level. So that's why we now have in the process, this is sort of in the process, very difficult to get these Schedule I illegal drugs approved. We work with psilocybin, the main ingredient in magic mushrooms. And it's a different condition, but we're thinking that if we could figure out what's going on in these cases with drug-induced synesthesia, perhaps there's some sharing of mechanisms such that that can shed light on cases of people from acquired Savant syndrome and synesthesia. So here's a model that we want to investigate. So this is psilocybin. It breaks down, actually. And what it does is it works like a serotonin agonist. And it actually goes in, and this is sort of just illustrated with the visual cortex. What it does is that it actually activates the visual cortex, those little neurons that look like pyramids and are named after them. But also, via interneurons, it also inhibits the thalamus. But since the thalamus already inhibits how much input or flow of information, as we also saw some examples of in the last talk, the inhibiting leads to flow of information in. So random information flows in. And this random activity may be paired with, well, I say auditory here, but that's because we usually see that in drug-induced synesthesia. And so we get a kind of synesthesia in that way. That's the sort of model we are investigating. I'm going to save that for Q&A. There are lots of other pointers that serotonin is underlying that. I haven't talked about autism because we haven't looked that much about autism, but there's a recent study showing that there are more synesthetes among the population of autists than there's in the normal population. And that's it. Thank you.